I want to welcome everybody. My name is John Tischler, and I'm the chairman of Waller. We annually gather here. This has become our annual tradition in our third year to remember Dr. King and find inspiration for our own individual and collective efforts to carry on his legacy. For the lawyers in the room, it's kind of an odd thing, but January is the month of renewal for lawyers. It's kind of a joke. But I don't want to take it too lightly because lawyers, especially in January, need uplifting. They need inspiration. And you're going to get that today, I can tell you. It's going to be great. 150 years ago, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And next month, if you haven't seen it or heard about it, the Tennessee State Museum will have the original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation for viewing, along with the original 13th Amendment, which of course abolished slavery in the United States. One of the great gifts that President Lincoln bestowed on us was his gift of words, which I think you're going to hear a lot today as well. These people are very gifted with their words as well. But one of the things he said is that it often requires more courage to do that which is right than the fear to do what is wrong. And so today, let us embrace the courage to do right. James Lawson, Rip Patton, and John Seigenthaler, along with Diane Nash, will make up our panelists today. They all had the courage to do what was right. We'll hear about their memories and the courageous acts that they undertook in the 50s and 60s to bring Nashville to the place and to the great place that it is today. We're also going to acknowledge the recipient of Waller's Endowed Scholarship, Natalie Green from the University of Tennessee. I also, while this is a Waller event, we are also honored to have a number of our clients and friends in the room. This includes many of Nashville's leaders. In a little while, Mayor Dean will be here, and he has an exciting announcement for us. But in addition to Mayor Dean, if you don't mind, if you are an elected official, would you please stand so we can give you our appreciation for the public service that you're doing for us all. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to invite Bishop Joseph Walker to come forward and deliver our invocation.
Let us pray. Oh Lord, we thank you for this day, and we are grateful and mindful, God, of your grace and your goodness to us from generation to generation. Thank you for Waller, and thank you for all those who have put together this amazing program as we commemorate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you for the extraordinary heroes and sheroes who are here today, who made a difference that we might be able to enjoy the liberties that we do today. We thank you for their stories and their life. Bless our time today. In your name we pray. Amen.
In 2011, when we kicked this off, we were honored to bestow our first scholarship on Misha Kaw. And if you recall, if you were here last year, Misha joined us. We like to identify students whose lives have already begun to show many of the principles and to be guided by a lot of the principles that Dr. King expounded. Today, we had the privilege of recognizing Natalie Green, a first-year law student at the University of Tennessee College of Law. Please join me in welcoming Natalie to the stage. I hope you'll take the time to read in your programs a little bit about Natalie. I also want to recognize Natalie's family who traveled here from Atlanta to be with us today. If you don't mind standing up. To give you some indication of the commitment that her mom and dad have made, they've had 7 children, and I believe 2 doctors and 2 lawyers on the way. An unbelievable commitment. So. At this time, I'd like to invite the Honorable Mayor Carl Dean, Mayor of Nashville.
Well, thank you, John, and good afternoon to everyone. I feel like there's a burden off my shoulders today. I don't know if you watched Nashville last night, but they elected a mayor. And I didn't win. I wasn't a candidate, but it was a load off my mind that a mayor has been elected now for Nashville. You know, this has been a good new year for Nashville so far. There was, of course, a story in the New York Times last week about being Nowville and the It City and all that. But I just want to reference for a moment that really the year began for me when Condé Nast, the great travel magazine, came out with a story where they said there are 5 cities in the world that you should visit in the year 2013. And those are Seoul, South Korea, Toronto, Ontario, Amsterdam, New Orleans, and Nashville. And I really know what you're all thinking. You're wondering, how the heck did Toronto and Amsterdam make that list? I don't know, but I know how Nashville made that list. Let me take just a minute to commend Waller for putting this program together. This is becoming a great tradition, and they deserve a lot of credit for doing this. I'm not going to talk long. I'm anxious to hear from our guest, but I do have something to say. First, I want to say to Diane, Reverend Lawson, and Rip, welcome back. And let me just thank you personally for what you did to right some wrongs that were occurring in our city 50 years ago. Thank you for your vision, for your courage, and for your strength. Thank you for putting your lives on the line for all of us. And thank you for making Nashville a leader in the civil rights movement. To be honest, I really don't know how long change would have taken if you hadn't have acted. Today we stand in the heart of everything that was going on 50 years ago. To our east is a courthouse where you, Diane, spoke with Mayor Briley and put in motion actions that would lead to the integration of downtown lunch counters. And to our west is Fifth Avenue, the street where those segregated lunch counters sat. But here is what I want to tell you. I know that Metro Nashville owes many debts to each of you and the countless other civil rights leaders who worked diligently and nonviolently to integrate this city. Today, I'm so excited to let you know that we will finally have a visible way to remember and honor your leadership through public art. Right now, Fifth Avenue between Church and Union is undergoing a major streetscape improvement to create an arts district in the heart of where you led protests at Crest and Woolworths. In partnership with my office, the Metro Arts Commission has initiated a national call to artists to develop concept proposals for public art work honoring the Nashville Civil Rights Movement. Some nationally known sculptors are on our short list. They will present designs after public meetings and a site visit to Nashville this spring. I'm so honored by your legacy and so proud that before my term ends, we will have a permanent reminder of your commitment, courage, and vision on Fifth Avenue. There's an account in the Old Testament about a permanent reminder. That's when Israel was told to memorialize a crossing over the Jordan River by putting stones in certain places. They were to do that so when the children asked, "What mean these stones?" then the parents could tell the story of how they miraculously crossed the Jordan River. On Fifth Avenue, when future generations are asked about the piece or asking questions about the piece of art memorializing you, then their parents can tell them how there was a time when everybody could not sit at the lunch counter and eat, and how through your actions, all of that changed. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Well, we're getting ready to celebrate our past, but I do want to say, if there's any reason, there are many reasons why Nashville has become so great, but I think what you just heard and the man that is leading this community deserves another round of applause. Well, now you're in for an incredible treat. This is a panel of eyewitnesses to the most important part of our history. It was the time that Nashville, in my opinion, moved from a backwater, from a small town, into the being that it has become. And it took incredible courage by a handful of people to dare to do it right, as President Lincoln told us. As the Met choirs told us, Dr. King called the Nashville movement the best organized and most disciplined initiative of all the national movement. In a speech at Fisk, he said he came to Nashville not to inspire, but to be inspired. That is our legacy as Nashvillians. Reverend James Lawson, a divinity student at Vanderbilt in the late 1950s, began training and mentoring a group of young college students. He called them Tuesday night workshops, and they focused on Gandhian values of nonviolence. He taught passive resistance and participated in planning activities that later became the sit-ins and the freedom rides that Nashville will be known forever. For his efforts, he was expelled from Vanderbilt University Divinity School, but he completed his studies at Boston University. I'm proud to say, as a Vanderbilt alumni, Vanderbilt has recognized the error of its ways, and in 2006 apologized to Reverend Lawson and his wife, and also invited him to come back as a distinguished professor, which he did for 4 years. He's been living as a pastor and a teacher in Los Angeles, where his oldest child has just become elected to the judiciary. Diane Nash was born in Chicago. She was surprised when she came here as a Fisk University student of the oppressive force of segregation. She began studying with Reverend Lawson and became a leader in the Nashville movement. She later became a leader in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and led freedom rides from Birmingham back to Jackson. Perhaps one of her most memorable examples of Diane's leadership was when she, at the head of a group of almost 5,000 people following the bombing of Attorney Luby's house, asked the mayor, is it morally right to segregate lunch counters? And he answered, no, it's not. Within 2 weeks of her courage, the lunch counters in Nashville were integrated. Our third panelist is Rip Patton. He was a music major at TSU, and he likewise began studying with Reverend Lawson. One of several freedom riders, he was arrested in Mississippi on bogus charges. He spent significant time in Parchman Prison, and it was his singing that held a special place in those folks who were incarcerated there's mind. He was expelled from TSU on the orders of the governor of Tennessee. 47 years later, he and a total of 14 others who were expelled from TSU were given honorary degrees by TSU. And finally, our own John Seigenthaler will moderate. John is a champion of constitutional protections of the First Amendment. He began his career at the Tennessean in 1949. He's reported and edited stories on the sit-ins and the Freedom Riders. On May 21, 1961, he tried to intervene in a Freedom Ride that had been stopped in Montgomery, and the Freedom Riders were being beaten. He likewise was beaten and hospitalized. John has worked on the presidential campaign for John F. Kennedy and worked for the Justice Department for the U.S. Attorney that was headed at that time by U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy. He eventually edited the Tennessean and helped start the USA Today. John, it is my pleasure to turn over the panel to you.
As my colleagues are being seated, Jim Lawson will be here, and Diane Nash, and are you here? Diane is on my left, and Jim and Rip are just beyond that. I want to begin by saying, from my heart, and I think the heart of all of us who are participating today, our thanks to the Walla Law Firm for making it possible for us to revisit a really important moment in the history of our city. It was a time when the three people with me here on the platform and others who followed and walked and demonstrated with them when they changed our city. I look around this room, and I know all of you have come today because you know that history. It is that history that's brought you here. You know about Jim Lawson's workshops at Clark Memorial United Baptist Church, Methodist Church. You know how those workshops led to the sit-ins. You know how those sit-ins changed downtown Nashville, as John just said. Lunch counters desegregated after that confrontation between Diane and Mayor West, that momentous day on the plaza in front of the City Hall. You know how when the Freedom Rides died, were over, had ended in Alabama, that first wave of Freedom Riders had been assaulted, beaten to the ground. You know the Freedom Riders were dead, and that it was because of the Nashville movement. It was because these young people who had changed our city, it was because they picked up the torch, took up the rides, and filled the jails and prisons of Mississippi, and drew others from all over the country. You know that that's how it happened. So I'm not going to dwell today on the past that you know, but I'm going to ask three brief questions, and I will tell you from long acquaintance with my three dear friends here on the panel, I will tell you there is no remote possibility that they will answer the question that I ask. But I will tell you, your lives will be enriched by listening to what they say. And so, Diane and Jim and Rip. I'd like to begin with the word that John Tish just mentioned. I'd like to ask about that courage. It's always puzzled me. As long as I've known you, I really have never understood where that courage came from. It's a reality. It existed. I know that you were college students, you and Rip, Diane. I know that Jim was a graduate student at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I know that you knew what lynch law justice was that ruled in this part of the country. I know that you understood what had happened to a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till. I know you knew of that violence and death. I know you knew that on the first night our schools were desegregated, a bomb blew Hattie Cotton School off its foundation. And still in the face of all of that violence and the danger, Jim Lawson talked to you about nonviolence. Where did the courage come from? Diane, Rip, and then Jim, if you would comment on that.
Well, John, let's see if I don't really answer the question you asked. I really don't know where the courage came from. I would go back to Chicago, excuse me, during the summers and think about some of the things I had done in the South, and I would think, that was really dangerous. I'm not going to do that anymore. But when the time came, the movement had a way of bringing things out of me that I didn't even know were there, such as courage. And fortunately, I was able to stand up when the time came. Another thing is that segregation was so humiliating. I think at that time, black people across the South had just had it up to here with segregation and were willing to go to great lengths to end it. I know that going to downtown Nashville shortly after I arrived as a student at Fisk was a humiliating and demoralizing experience for me. It was possible to order food from restaurants on a takeout basis, but you couldn't sit there and eat it. So if you went downtown in Nashville around the lunch hour, the blacks who worked in the downtown area would be sitting on the curbs near the alleys eating their lunch that they had either bought from a restaurant on a takeout basis or brought from home. And when I followed a segregation law, I felt not only humiliated, but as though I was agreeing that somehow I was too inferior to use a front door or a restaurant that the ordinary public used. And so I really started looking for a way to end segregation. And finally, a lot of courage for me came from the students and older people who were working with the movement. We were very committed not only to loving our opponent, but to each other. We had a group of about 30 people who were the Nashville Student Central Committee, representatives from all the colleges that were taking part in the sit-in. And one of the things that Jim taught us was that if one person was getting seriously beaten and seemed singled out, one way you could come to their defense and keep that person from getting killed or even more injured was to put your body between him or her and the person who was inflicting the violence. And to be part of a group where I was willing to put my body between a person and harm, and to have confidence that the people in the group were willing to put their bodies between me and harm, was just an incredible experience. So we gained a lot of courage from each other.
Rip, would you respond, please?
Well, I grew up here in Nashville, and I was accustomed to segregation, and I lived segregation. I went to the segregated movies, and I knew that we couldn't eat at the lunch counters downtown or go into the theaters in the front door or go to the restaurants. And when Jim came to town to teach us about nonviolence, I wanted to be a part of that because I wanted to make a change. I saw that there were a lot of out-of-state students. Tennessee State was a very popular school, and there were a lot of out-of-state students from that took part in the movement. And this was my home, and so I said, well, I need to clean up my own house first. And so I took part in the movement. I went to the workshops and took part in the sit-ins and the freedom rides. But I like to go to the Bible. I'm reminded that in 2011, I got a call from the Oprah Winfrey Show, and the lady was asking me questions about why did I join the movement, was I afraid when I went on the freedom rides, and all kind of questions. And so I was trying to take her back to my part in the sit-ins. I wanted to give her some history first. And she said, I don't want to hear that. That's not what I want to hear. I want to know why, and this and that and the other. And I started thinking, and I said, well, you know, if people won't listen, maybe they'll listen to something else. And I said, do you have a Bible handy? And she said, yes. And I said, turn to Romans 12, first and second verse. And she found it, and I said, it simply reads, of course I have my Bible here today, therefore I urge you, brother, in view of God's mercy, to offer your body to offer your body as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world. That's when I stopped and I said, all of my life up to this point, I had conformed to segregation. But then the second part, do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This man renewed my mind, and I'm still in the renewing mode.
Me too.
I've found it always a fine experience to return to Nashville, if even for only one day, but especially for this moment. I want to also join in with John Seigenthaler in thanking the Waller firm for making this a 3-year tradition now, and I hope it will continue to go on and will continue to find its way creatively and powerfully. The four of us up here are part of a very wonderful family. Diane said that the movement gave her courage, and she felt that that's fundamentally true. But these are people here, and there are some in the audience also as well, some out there, who I've always felt have been in my family for 50, 60 years now. And that's really part of what it means, I think, when the Christian church talks about the people of God, which it doesn't often do, but the people of God as described in the journey in especially the Hebrew Bible, but also the Christian Bible. Diane and Rip have both described this in their own ways, and it's both stories represent how big this story of courage is and how we come to it from different directions. I want to simply say that the courage comes from soul and heart and mind and strength, which is a description out of the scriptures that I learned, which I think is one of the great pieces of wisdom that we of the human race have written, though we may not have learned it that well, but it's been written, and it's there in ancient literature for us to try to understand. It's one of the stories of how the human race has come about. The movement was very much rooted, as I taught also, in Gandhi and in Jesus. Now, Christianity in the United States doesn't want to accept the notion that the spirituality and the faith and the notions in the movement that formed us all, whether we were practicing Christians or not at the time, did indeed come from that spectacular figure of the first century, and I say that without trying to put dogma around his name, Jesus. And then Gandhi, in the 20th century, invented or coined the term nonviolence. And Gandhi was a political figure who was a wonderful man of prayer and faith. King began to use the term nonviolence in perhaps February of 1956 to describe the Montgomery bus boycott. But courage and compassion and character come out of the root soul of our creation as human beings. We can make a choice to tap that and try to live out of it, try to understand what it means and is about, or we can just take it for granted and not do the work that you said you're still doing and I'm still doing too. So I think that all across the struggle of the 50s and 60s, you can find extraordinary stories of ordinary people who tapped the powers of their inner life, of what ancient scriptures call heart, soul, mind, strength. And we came out of that, and we grew in that, and we were given probably far more than we ever contributed. That's a message that it's our turn to exercise.
Could I ask each of you for a moment to think about and then speak about the life and what that life meant to you, the life of the man for whom this holiday is named, Dr. Martin Luther King. He said you inspired him. He said the Nashville movement was the movement in this country that led all others. Could you address for a few moments what Martin Luther King meant to you and how you were motivated and inspired by him? Diane?
Well, I guess like so many thousands of people, when Martin delivered a an address or a speech. I think every single time I would leave with renewed resolve and energy. And personally, he was probably more of a real figure to me, a real person, as a result of knowing him. I make people amused sometimes by saying I have the distinction of being able to say that I double dated with Martin Luther King. Martin was on his way to the Bahamas to work on one of his books, and my former husband and I went along with him and Coretta, and I have some lovely memories of a wonderful restaurant with the moon shining through the palm trees, and a delightful evening with actually the three of them. Martin was, I'm sure you've heard people say many times how funny he was and what a sense of humor he had, and that's all true. You can imagine he was a really interesting person to go to dinner with. But there were things about him that I used to just sometimes find amazing, like the amount of work he was able to grind out in a single day. And like his steadfastness, one of the things that I recall him saying, addressing the opposition, is that we will wear you down. And he was capable of doing that. He was consistent and focused and on the subject. And I guess another thing that endeared him to me was that he, just like everybody, there were times when he was insecure and afraid and intimidated and had problems, but over a period of time, he struggled with those problems and overcame them. And to me, that's really a great man.
Rip, would you speak to the question of Dr. King's impact on your life?
Well, I was a foot soldier, and so I did not have a chance to really sit and talk with Dr. King. I only met him on two occasions. One was here in Nashville, May 20th, 1960, when he was the keynote speaker at Fisk University after the bombing of Z. Alexander Luby's home, which took place on April 19th, 1960. And then the second time I was in a room with him was in Montgomery, Alabama, at the home of Dr. Harris, and I think that was on May 24th of 1961. But just to listen to him, not only in person, but to listen to his speeches, I do agree with Diane that it gave you courage, it inspired you to move forward in the movement. And so I just didn't have that close connection with him as Diane and Dr. Lawson and some of the, what we call lieutenants at that time. I was always kind of with Bernard Lafayette, and Bernard was one of the lieutenants, and when the lieutenant said move, I would move. And so that's the way it was.
Well, I think, we get perspective from many sides here, and you get many more perspectives from his family, from friends and colleagues and people he went to jail with and so forth and so on. And there is a growing library of literature from the struggle that reveals increasingly much of this, so it's important. But what I want to say is that one, without the development of a nonviolent direct action movement, there would have been no Martin Luther King. And we must not forget that. Just as without a movement in the 18th century, there would have been no revolutionary spirit about democracy in the United States. There would have been no Thomas Jefferson. So we must link this up. Martin was elected by some 40 to 50,000 black people in Montgomery to be the spokesperson and the president of the bus boycott that ran for 381 days. We should not forget that. So there is an indelible weaving of the production of people like Rip and Diane and John and myself, and the emerging of a movement that has extraordinary goals to break the back of Jim Crow law and to start the process of dismantling racism, and I would say sexism and violence and economic exploitation or plantation capitalism. All of that is a mixture of who Martin King, and he had the preparation as a child and a young man, as a student, as a graduate student, as a pastor, preacher, Baptist. He had the grounding so that he became a matchless spokesperson and symbol for nonviolent struggle. It was the inspiration of Martin King and the bus boycott that caused Kelly Miller Smith and Andrew White and Helen Roberts and Jim Lawson and some others to decide nonviolence worked with the Montgomery bus boycott. Can it work again? This was a question that King asked himself in 57, 58. What's the next stage? And Nashville was our effort to begin the answering of that question, so that when a group of us here decide, I've named 2 or 3 of them, but there were many others, did basic research in 58, and in early 59 met almost weekly for 4 or 5 or 6 months and assessed Nashville, looked at the plight of black people in Nashville, the injustice and the cruelty and the indignity, and then made the decision, we're going to organize to desegregate downtown Nashville. That was the decision made. The recruitment of students, the recruitment of others for the workshops that began then in September, which I led, was done at the behest of this Nashville small community. If we had put that proposal to a vote in the city of Nashville, the white power structures would absolutely said never, no. But in many ways, traditional black community would have said also, well, you're going to get into trouble. And we don't want any trouble. But the racism, the segregation, the laws, the customs, the spirituality of that time was itself the trouble. And you know this personally, that if you reach a personal crisis of some kind, whatever it is, if you do not put that personal crisis on the table in front of you, maybe with friends, maybe with others, but at least initially yourself, and unravel it and analyze it, if you do not do that, you're going to do very badly moving through that crisis and turning the crisis into strength. The same essential law prevails for a society, for a city, for a family. We human beings are so constructed that we diminish our lives by being afraid to face crisis. We discover dimensions of life that we never imagined when we're prepared to engage in the struggle of living and face the uncomfortable places and then find ways to creatively move through them. So, no movement, no king. And one of the great things for me about Martin is watching him from 1955 to 1968 and working with him and being in many different settings with him. One of the great things for me is that no matter the criticism and the talk nowadays, and a lot of it even then, Martin King lived up to the challenge of presenting to Western civilization the notion that nonviolent living and life and action is the moral imperative to the use of the fist or the drone or organizing war anywhere in the world.
You know, Jim, when I hear you speak about Nashville, and I have many times asked myself, why Nashville? How did it happen that we in this city, without realizing it, without appreciating it, much of the city solidly opposed to it, how were we so lucky? And I think you've given us a sense. I don't know whether it could have happened in Birmingham or in Jackson, Mississippi, had you gone there instead of here. I just simply don't know whether it could have worked. Could it?
Well, of course, I didn't know that either. But I thank God for the fact that I did not go to Nash. I did not go to Atlanta, which was my first choice. And Martin did not say go to Atlanta.
And of course, you'd been in Little Rock.
I've been at Little Rock. So I made the decision that I should move from Ohio, and with other people with whom I talked, we decided Nashville was the best place. And in my generation, in my father's generation, mother's generation, we would have called that providential. John Lewis uses the German word Zeitgeist to define the fact that in Nashville by 58, 59, there were people like Rip and Diane and Jim Bevel and Andrew White and C.J. Walker and Dolores Wilkerson and a whole range of people were all here. So this was the best place for me to have been. And then personally, it was best because Atlanta had no theological school at the level of Vanderbilt Divinity School. Just did not, which I did not realize when I was, I wanted to make the move to some place where I could continue my graduate work in theology. And it would have been a terrible mistake had I gone to Dallas or Atlanta or to Duke University. They did not have the level of faculty or understanding of Christian ideas or biblical studies that Vanderbilt in 58 had. So
how lucky we are you made that decision, Rip.
Let me add to that. In talking to Reverend C.T. Vivian, and we both agree on this, and it's what you touched on is the fact that John Lewis from Troy, Alabama, wanted to go to Troy State. He didn't want to come to Nashville. Bernard Lafayette from Tampa, Florida, wanted to go to school in Florida. James Bevel, I think he wanted to work in Mississippi and Alabama. C.T. Vivian, who lived in he lived in Peoria, Illinois. He wanted to go into Chicago and work. And so C.T. and I, we agreed that this movement was God sent. Because all of the people who had different agendas ended up in Nashville. Our Central Committee, those names ended up here in Nashville, some at the same time. didn't know each other, but they became the Central Committee. And so it's, as I say, it's just God sent.
Let me ask Diane a question that has always puzzled me a bit. You were a young woman. Young women did not lead. It was a time when young women and old women were governed by rules that were at least as old as the rules that govern race. When I ask you about it in the past, you sort of say, well, I really wasn't a leader. I was one of them. And still there you were on the City Hall Plaza confronting Carl Dean's predecessor by several, Mayor Ben West. It was you who put the question that literally led him to say it's not morally right. Would you talk about the role of women in the movement? Because you were not alone. There were other women who were active. You are seen as the leader, but would you just discuss how it came to be that you emerged in the way that you did?
Yes, I'll tell you exactly why. It was because the Central Committee voted that I should be the chairperson and wouldn't take no for an answer. I gave every excuse I could think of, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. I was afraid to be the chairperson. I remember the night that I was elected, I came back to the dormitory and Kathy, my roommate, wasn't home. The room was dark. And I didn't have the strength to walk to the other side of the room and turn on the light. I remember leaning against the wall on Kathy's side of the room and thinking, we are going to come up against segregationist white men who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s and who are businessmen and politicians. And who are we? A group of 18, 20, 22-year-old students. What do we know? What will have happened in the next 2 or 3 months? And that's why I got to be the chairperson, because we had had 2 men who were chairmen, and they missed meetings and they missed demonstrations, and we couldn't have that because someone could have been killed or injured if the leadership of the Central Committee was not efficient. And when they came back to meetings, we said, where were you? And they said they were studying. Both said the same thing. And each held office for about maybe 10 days or 2 weeks. And we thanked them for their services and got somebody else. So at that point, it's because the Central Committee wouldn't take no for an answer. I want to just add one thing to the question before, though, that I think people might not really realize, and it's this. Nashville was the reason that the whole Southern civil rights movement was a nonviolent movement. And that's because when Ella Baker, who was the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference at the time, when sit-ins at lunch counters and restaurants broke out throughout the South, Miss Baker saw the value in bringing leadership from all these different campuses together. And she organized a conference that took place at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, over the Easter weekend in 1960. Well, at that point, Nashville was the only city that had successfully desegregated lunch counters, and we had done it through nonviolence. So therefore, the conference was able to see that nonviolence works, and therefore they accepted nonviolence as the philosophy behind the whole Southern movement. And Jim Lawson drafted the mission statement at that first conference where SNCC was born, and it talked about, the mission statement talked about nonviolence and achieving what we call the beloved community.
Let me ask you, Rip. Let me ask you about Parchman Prison. As far as I know, Parchman Prison was the hellhole of the American penal system. And here you are, as David Halberstam has described them, children in Parchman Prison. And I'd like for you to talk about, again, that whole question of fear that must have taken hold as you went into that place. And I'd like for you, if you could just briefly explain to this audience, as you've explained to some of us in the past, you, a music major, how song lifted the spirits of those who were in that hellhole?
Well, one of the things that we would do not only in Parchman but in Jackson, in all of their institutions, the city jail, the county farm, and then on to Parchman Penitentiary, we would wake up early in the morning with song. Now, this room is filled with freedom riders in your own right, and we're going to wake up in Parchman, and I'm going to stand, and I need the choir's help, and they're going to stand. In the movement, we would go into churches, for example, and listen to the music, the songs that they would sing in the churches. And there were times when we would simply change one or two words of the song. And there's a song that everybody is familiar with. It just simply says, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. When we were in the jail houses, we changed one word. We went from Jesus to freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. The second verse, ain't no harm to keep your mind stayed on freedom. The third, walking and talking with my mind stayed on freedom. And then back to the first verse. So I'm going to ask you, all of you freedom riders in the audience, to imagine yourself waking up in the morning after a day when the prison system has done something to try to break you. And I'll go to the worst thing that I think that they did to us was, since we're eating, one day they put some stool softener, quite a bit, in our food. We didn't know it was in there. They turned off all the water. We're in an 8-by-6 cell, 8 feet by 6 feet, only 2 people per cell in the part I was in. You have a commode and a wash bowl. They turned off the water and turned on the heat in the hottest part of the day. And that happened for a couple of days that they kept the water off. Of course, they would give us water for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But they did that. And so we would wake up, and I hope I'm in a good key for everybody. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Now I want you to sing. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Ain't no harm Ain't no harm to keep your mind, I don't hear you, stayed on freedom. Ain't no harm to keep your mind, stayed on freedom. Ain't no harm to keep your mind, stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom. Walking and talking with my mind, stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Thank you. I want to do one more. When we talk about soul, heart, mind, and strength, something that happened right here during the stand-ins at the movie theater, how song will really help you. One of our females was in line, a young lady from Birmingham, and a young white male walked up to her with a cigarette and said, "I'm going to put this cigarette out in your face." She simply looked at him, but in her mind's eye, she was humming a song which simply said, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land." Now, I don't know if he heard that, because she wasn't singing it out where he could hear it, but that was her strength, not to move, not to flinch, and to be able to take that cigarette burn if he had done that. But for some reason, he decided not to do it and walked away. The power of your inner soul through music. Thank you.
John?
Wow.
But John, may I just
Yeah, absolutely, Jim.
music was one of the tools, but you need to remember also that in the workshops here in Nashville and elsewhere where I taught them, we talked about facing violence, intimidation, and prison, and the possibility of death. So that was also a part of the preparation. And one of the things we taught, and this became universal across the movement, was that if you're in jail, if you go to jail, try to make the best of it as an experience that strengthens you and doesn't tear you down. So music is a part of that. Reading poetry and the Bible and scriptures and conversation with your fellow inmates is important. You can even spend some good time talking to the folk who are there because of some major kind of wrongdoing and discover their humanity, so that jail doesn't have to be an obstacle to life, but rather a part of the stepping stone to life. And much of that became a part of the common story that developed, and that we heard over and over again in various places across the South as all kinds of communities broke forth. To me, it's very important to understand that the civil rights movement was one of the most massive efforts on the part of the people of the United States to extend the revolutionary spirit that we can be people who govern ourselves, that government should be of, by, and for the people. It needs to be understood, therefore, as that, because we who are living, it is still our turn, personally and socially, to take the steps that are needed to move our land in the direction of access, opportunity for every child, for every boy, anywhere in our 50 states, and in fact, anywhere in the world. That is the task that we have with the gift of life. And Nashville was the most significant place in my own life for helping to learn about that and to become a part of it.
John, Diane would like to say just a word before you close.
Our time went so fast that I really wanted to just make a brief comment about right now. One of the things that really changed my life was when Jim Lawson was teaching us about how essential truth is. And, you know, when the children were murdered in Connecticut, I think the whole country's heart was broken. And I wonder why we cannot understand that when our drones murder children in Pakistan, how everybody in the whole country in Pakistan feels the same way we did with the children in Connecticut. When our bombs kill innocent children in other countries. And I'm so troubled when I see our president and Mr. Biden, the first and second in charge of the most violent thing in the world, which is our government, talking about how to cut down on violence. And they talk about video games, and that might have a place. Mental health certainly has a place. But as a result of the leaders of our government, who are supposed to be well-adjusted mentally and emotionally, and our leaders, we have a culture of violence in this country. Black people are fond of saying they're glad that there's a black president because it tells black kids that they can be anything that they want to be, and that's true. But Jim Lawson said something a number of years ago after Columbine, and he said, you know, children and young people learn how to live life by watching us. And I think that that's very true. One thing we need to really start demanding is that our governments, federal, state, and national, become less violent. And I think that that is an important piece that nobody's talking about in cutting down on the violence in this country. Because right now, in order to qualify for president and not appear like you're weak, you have to be to say that you will be extremely violent if elected. That's what I wanted to say.
Well, I apologize for us running a little long. We have one more thing to do. I'm going to invite Bishop Walker to come back up and deliver the benediction. As he's making his way up here, I think there is at least one other freedom rider in our midst. Would you, or any freedom riders or participants in our sit-ins, please stand so we can recognize you.
I think Matthew Walker Jr. was here earlier, and I'm not sure. Well, there he is.
Finally, on your way out, we have a limited number of these CDs. These are our gifts to you, and it is the NBC News special on the white paper sit-in. I hope you'll take one. For the Waller folks in the audience, if you would refrain from taking them right now, we may run out. We'll get some more to you. Finally, I want to thank Mark Green, who is the director of our marketing. He put this all together. He made us all look good, and I want to give him a round of applause. Thank you, and come back next year.
And Lord, we thank you for this day. Thank you for these extraordinary stories, extraordinary people. Help us all as we move forward to make such a difference in pursuit of that beloved community. And may the peace that transcends time be with us from this place. Amen.